This is a boring history video made for sleep. You don't need to listen closely. You don't need to remember anything. There will be no loud sounds. No dramatic moments. No surprises. This video will continue slowly and quietly until the very end. Even if you fall asleep halfway through, that is completely fine. If falling asleep to slow stories like this feels comfortable to you, there are many more that sound the same on this channel. Tonight may not be the last time. Tonight, we will simply spend some time in a quiet moment from the past. Nothing important is going to happen. Just let the words fade into the background. And now, we begin. Did you know that in the Middle Ages, the snooze button was actually a biological necessity, as people often woke up in the middle of the night for a second sleep to discuss dreams or reflect in the dark? This story takes you through a single, vivid day in the life of a medieval soul. We will explore the pungent reality of morning routines, the surprising social etiquette of the communal bath, the precarious engineering of garderobes, medieval toilets, and the crowded, straw-filled beds where families sought warmth. Forget the polished images of Hollywood. This is the raw, tactile, and aromatic truth of medieval existence. The world did not wake up to the chime of a digital alarm, but to the rhythmic tolling of church bells and the cold, damp reality of a room that had lost its fire hours ago. For our protagonist, the day began not once, but twice. In the deep silence of the midnight hour, they had already experienced the first sleep. In this era, human circadian rhythms were split. After 4 hours of rest, the entire household would stir. They didn't get up to work, but rather to exist in a liminal space, praying, whispering in the shadows, or simply staring at the embers of the hearth. This was the watch, a time believed to be the most creative and spiritual part of the night. But as the sun began to crest over the horizon, casting a gray, misty light through the narrow, unglazed windows, the second sleep came to an end. The bed itself was a complex ecosystem. It wasn't a sleek mattress on a frame, but a heavy wooden box filled with a linen sack. This sack was stuffed with straw, pea shucks, or, for the very lucky, goose feathers. However, the filling was rarely just organic bedding. It was a sanctuary for fleas, lice, and bedbugs that thrived in the warmth of human bodies. The first task of the morning was not a shower, but a vigorous scratch. There was no sense of privacy as we know it. In the single room of a standard medieval home, the entire family, and sometimes a traveling guest or a particularly prized animal, huddled together under heavy wool blankets. The communal warmth was the only defense against the biting chill of a stone-walled house that breathed the dampness of the earth. As the light strengthened, the protagonists sat up, their feet hitting a floor covered in rushes. These were long, green plants strewn across the ground to act as a primitive carpet. While they looked fresh on top, the bottom layers often hid a grim collection of bone scraps, spilled ale, and various excretions that had been trodden into the soil over months. The smell was a permanent fixture of life, a mixture of damp straw, wood smoke, and the lingering musk of unwashed linen. Clothing was not changed daily. The linen chemise worn to bed served as the base layer for the day's attire, acting as a sweat absorber that would only be laundered once every few weeks. To wash for the morning meant something very different than it does today. As the light of dawn sharpened, filtered through the thick haze of the peat fire's dying embers, the immediate demands of the body could no longer be ignored. There was no porcelain sanctuary waiting down a hallway, no silent rush of water to carry away the evidence of the night. Instead, our protagonist moved toward the corner of the room where a heavy wooden lid sat atop a simple stool, or, for those in more fortified stone dwellings, they stepped toward a narrow, cold projection in the wall known as the garderobe. This small, precarious closet was a feat of medieval engineering that prioritized gravity over comfort. The garderobe was often nothing more than a stone seat with a hole that opened directly into the void. It was positioned over the castle moat or a deep cesspit far below. To sit there was to feel the sudden, biting rush of an updraft, a vertical wind tunnel that brought with it the chilling damp of the morning air and the concentrated stench of weeks of waste. There was a peculiar irony to the name garderobe, which shared its roots with the word wardrobe. People had discovered that the pungent fumes of ammonia rising from the pit below acted as a natural pesticide, thus, they hung their expensive woolen cloaks and tunics on pegs near the latrine hole. The stench that would make a modern nose recoil was, to them, a functional defense against the moths and lice that threatened to eat their wealth. For the common folk living in timber-framed houses, the ritual was less architectural but equally visceral. A communal bucket or a ceramic chamber pot served the needs of the family. In the morning, this vessel had to be emptied, often leading to a brisk walk to the nearest dung farmer or a designated trench. There was no soft, quilted paper to provide a clean finish. Instead, the hand reached for whatever nature or the household could spare. Depending on one's status and the season, this meant a handful of moss, a bunch of dried hay, a scrap of old wool, or even the smooth surface of a large leaf. For the very poor, it was often nothing more than a gomp stick, a smoothed piece of wood. The lack of running water dictated a different relationship with the hands. While we view this morning ritual as a private, sterile necessity, the medieval person saw it as a functional, albeit smelly, part of the cycle of the earth. There was no concept of germs, but there was a deep understanding of miasma, the idea that bad smells cause disease. To combat the lingering odor of the garderobe, people would often carry small sachets of dried lavender or mint, or simply press their noses into a sprig of rosemary gathered from the garden. With the first grim task of the day complete, the protagonist moved toward the water basin, where the next challenge of medieval hygiene, the struggle against the grime of labor, awaited. With the physical relief of the morning finished, the protagonist turned their attention to the wash basin. In a world where water did not flow from a tap, every drop was a precious resource that had to be hauled by hand from a communal well or a nearby stream. Consequently, the idea of submerging the entire body daily was not only impractical but seen as potentially dangerous. The prevailing medical wisdom, influenced by the theory of the humors, suggested that hot water opened the pores, allowing corrupt air and disease to enter the vital organs. Therefore, hygiene was a localized affair, focusing strictly on the visible parts of the body, the hands and the face. The water in the pewter or ceramic basin was cold, likely skimmed of a thin layer of ice if it was winter. There was no bubbly, scented lather. Instead, the protagonist used a washball, a hard sphere made of lye, ash, and animal fat, often scented with rosewater or herbs to mask the caustic smell of the soap itself. This soap was harsh, it bit into the skin, stripping away oils and dirt with a ruthless efficiency. The washing was a ritual of social signaling. To have clean hands and a clear face was a sign of a person who respected social order and avoided the slovenly appearance of a hermit or an outcast. They scrubbed their fingers thoroughly, for these were the same fingers that would soon be dipping into communal bowls of pottage. Special attention was paid to the mouth and teeth. While we often imagine medieval people with blackened stumps for teeth, the reality was surprisingly different. Because sugar was an incredibly expensive luxury reserved for the highest nobility, the average person's teeth were often quite healthy, albeit worn down by the grit found in stone-ground flour. The protagonist took a small piece of rough linen cloth, a mouth cloth, and rubbed their teeth vigorously. They might use a powder made of burnt breadcrumbs, salt, or even crushed eggshells to act as an abrasive. To freshen the breath, they chewed on seeds of fennel, cloves, or sprigs of parsley, treating the mouth like a garden to be tended rather than a void to be ignored. After the face was splashed and the eyes cleared of sleep's crust, the water in the basin was not wasted. It was gray and clouded with the morning's grime, but it would be used once more to rinse a cloth for a quick wipe under the arms or to dampen the hair. Hair care was less about washing and more about mechanical cleaning. They believed that vigorous brushing with a wooden or bone comb moved the natural oils from the scalp to the ends of the hair, protecting it from the elements. As the protagonist dried their face with a coarse towel, the dampness of the room and the scent of the wood smoke combined to create a heavy atmosphere. The day was beginning in earnest, and the next ritual, the preparation of the body for the heavy labor of the fields or the workshop, demanded their full attention. As the dampness of the wash water evaporated from the skin, the protagonist turned to the chair where their garments had been laid out, or rather, where they had been piled to keep them off the rush-covered floor. Dressing in the Middle Ages was not a matter of fashion but a strategic layering against the elements and social expectations. The most vital component of this ensemble was the chemise, or smock. This was a long, loose tunic made of undyed linen. It was the only garment that touched the skin directly, acting as a structural barrier between the body's sweat and the expensive, heavy wool of the outer layers. Linen was the medieval equivalent of a sponge. It was designed to wick away oils and moisture, and it was this layer, rather than the person's skin, that was washed frequently. Pulling the cool linen over their head, the protagonist felt the immediate scratch of the fabric. It was not the soft, brushed cotton of the modern era, but a sturdy, hand-woven textile that softened only after years of wear. Because the chemise was the hygiene layer, it was often changed more often than any other piece of clothing. A person might own only 2 or 3, rotating them as they were scrubbed with lye in the local stream. Over this went the kirtle, or tunic, a more fitted garment usually made of wool. Wool was the miracle fabric of the age, naturally water-resistant, incredibly warm even when damp, and remarkably durable. It did not need frequent washing. Instead, it was brushed with a stiff bristled tool to remove dried mud and dust. Then came the hose, which were not the elasticized leggings we know today. These were 2 separate tubes of woven fabric, one for each leg, fastened to a belt or the waistband of the breechclout, underwear, with small linen ties called points. Tying these points was a finicky task for cold fingers, but essential for mobility. There was no left or right shoe. The turn shoes, made of single layers of leather, were stitched inside out and then flipped, molding themselves to the shape of the feet only through the heat and pressure of a long day's walk. To protect these soft leather soles from the filth of the streets, the protagonist might later step into pattens, wooden overshoes with heavy soles that acted like stilts to keep the wearer above the muck. Finally, the protagonist wrapped a hood or a coif around their head. In the Middle Ages, an uncovered head was a sign of disorder or low moral standing. The coif, a simple white linen cap that tied under the chin, kept the hair clean and protected from the soot of the hearth. As they fastened their leather belt, from which hung a small pouch containing a knife and perhaps a whetstone, the silhouette of a medieval person was complete. They were now a walking fortress of fabric, insulated against the drafty halls and the biting wind, ready to face a world where one's clothing was a permanent record of their trade, their wealth, and their place in the divine hierarchy. Stepping across the threshold was a transition from the stale, smoky intimacy of the home into the sharp, aggressive reality of the outdoors. As the protagonist pushed open the heavy oak door, the morning air didn't just carry the scent of nature, it carried the concentrated essence of a living, breathing community. In a medieval town, the streets were narrow, winding veins of earth and stone, often slanting toward a central gutter known as a kennel. This was the city's primary artery for waste. Despite various local ordinances forbidding the practice, the morning hours were a frantic time for clearing out the night's accumulations. The cry of "Garde l'eau," a corruption of the French "Gare de l'eau," watch out for the water, was a common warning before a basin of grey wash water or worse was sent cascading from an upper window. The ground beneath the protagonist's feet was a treacherous mosaic. The soft, churned mud was mixed with animal dung from the passing carts, vegetable scraps discarded by vendors, and the ubiquitous straw that seemed to leak out of every doorway. To navigate this required a peculiar, high-stepping gait, especially if one wasn't wearing wooden pattens. The sounds were equally overwhelming, the rhythmic clink-clink of the blacksmith's hammer, the bleating of sheep being driven to the market square, and the constant, melodic shouting of street criers selling everything from hot pies to fresh rushes. There was no background hum of engines, only the cacophony of muscle, metal, and wood. As they walked, the protagonist passed the communal conduit or fountain. In larger towns, this was the social heart of the district. Water was piped in through lead or hollowed elm trunks, and it was here that the true pulse of the neighborhood could be felt. Women gathered with heavy ceramic jugs, gossiping about the latest miracle or the rising price of grain, while water-bearers filled large wooden buckets to sell to those who lived too far to carry their own. The water was often relatively clean at the source, but the area around it was perpetually damp and slick with green moss, smelling of wet stone and crowded humanity. The protagonist's destination was the local market, but even this was a lesson in medieval hygiene. The shambles, the street of the butchers, was a place of visceral intensity. Blood from the morning's slaughter ran in the gutters, and the air was thick with the copper tang of raw meat and the buzzing of flies. Yet, amidst this filth, there were strict rules. Meat had to be sold on raised wooden boards to keep it away from the dogs, and inspectors known as ale tasters, or flesh tasters, prowled the stalls to ensure that nothing corrupt was being offered to the public. The medieval person lived in a world of extremes, the sublime beauty of a cathedral spire reaching for the heavens, and the muddy reality of a street where life and death were inextricably, and aromatically, linked. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows against the timber-framed houses, the rhythm of labor paused. This was the hour of the nun meat, the primary meal that fueled the body for the remaining hours of daylight. The protagonist returned to a home where the table was not a permanent fixture of the room, but a literal board laid across wooden trestles. This setting of the board was the first step in a communal ritual governed by a surprisingly strict code of hygiene, designed to prevent the spread of illness in a world where everyone dipped their hands into the same vessels. Before a single morsel was touched, the ritual of the lavabo began. In wealthier households, a servant would bring a silver ewer and a basin. In our protagonist's home, it was a simple ceramic jug and a shared towel. Water was poured over the hands to wash away the dust of the street and the grime of the workshop. This wasn't just a physical cleaning, it was a moral one. To eat with unwashed hands was seen as a sign of spiritual negligence. Once cleaned, the hands were dried on a communal linen cloth, and the diners took their places. There were no individual plates as we understand them today. Instead, the protagonist used a trencher, a thick, stale slab of 4-day-old wholemeal bread that served as a porous, edible plate. The meal was a symphony of communal dipping. A large mess or bowl of pottage, a thick stew of grains, leeks, and seasonal vegetables, sat in the center. The protagonist used a personal spoon carved from wood or horn, but for the meat or solid vegetables, they used their fingers. However, the rule of 3 applied: only the thumb, index, and middle fingers of the right hand were supposed to touch the food. The left hand was considered unclean, reserved for more menial tasks, and was never to enter the shared bowl. This unspoken rule was the medieval version of a sterile barrier, a way to keep the shared meal from becoming a source of contagion. As they ate, the trencher bread slowly soaked up the juices and fats of the stew, becoming soft and flavorful. Etiquette dictated that one should never double-dip a bitten piece of bread back into the communal pot, nor should one wipe their greasy fingers on the tablecloth, if the family was wealthy enough to own one. Instead, fingers were licked clean or wiped on a scrap of secondary bread. At the end of the meal, the sodden, juice-filled trenchers were not eaten by the family. They were gathered up and placed in a basket to be given to the alms basket at the church door or tossed to the household dogs. This was the medieval cycle of waste. Nothing was discarded that could still provide nourishment to another living creature. As the afternoon sun intensified, baking the narrow streets and the thatched roofs, the air grew heavy and stagnant. In this era, sweat was viewed through the lens of Galenic medicine. It was not merely a cooling mechanism but an excretion of superfluous humors. To the medieval mind, the body was a vessel of 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and an imbalance led to illness. As the protagonist labored under the midday heat, the dampness spreading across their linen chemise was seen as the body purging itself of internal heat and corrupt vapors. Body odor was an expected, even natural, byproduct of a working life, yet there were sophisticated ways of managing the sensory fallout of a long, hot day. The protagonist didn't have the luxury of a midday shower, but they possessed a deep knowledge of botany. To combat the mounting musk of the afternoon, they might carry a pomander, if they were of the merchant class, a perforated metal ball containing ambergris or musk. For our protagonist, however, relief came from the strewing herbs that lined the floors and the small bunches of dried tansy or wormwood tucked into their belt. These plants were chosen for their sharp scents, which were believed to pierce through the heavy, disease-carrying miasma of the heat. When the smell of one's own labor became too pungent, a quick rub of crushed mint leaves against the wrists or neck provided a fleeting, cooling sharpness. Thirst was a constant companion in the heat, but the solution was rarely plain water. Experience had taught the medieval person that raw water from stagnant sources brought the gripes or the flux. Instead, the protagonist turned to small ale, a weak, fermented beverage that had been boiled during the brewing process, effectively killing most pathogens. It was cloudy, nutritious, and slightly effervescent, acting as both a hydrator and a liquid snack. They drank it from a communal leather jack or a wooden mazer, passing the vessel around the workshop. This shared hydration was a moment of respite, a chance to wipe the salt from their brow with a linen sleeve and feel the evaporation pull the heat from their skin. Despite the grime, there was a certain pride in honest sweat. It was the mark of the laborer, the physical manifestation of the biblical decree to earn bread by the sweat of one's brow. However, as the afternoon wore on and the layers of wool and linen became increasingly heavy, the protagonist's thoughts began to drift toward the evening's possibility of a more thorough cleansing. In the distance, the bells of the local monastery rang for vespers, signaling that the most grueling hours of the day were passing. The prospect of the stews, or a rare communal bathhouse visit began to feel less like a luxury and more like a necessity for the weary, salt-crusted body. The sun began its slow descent, painting the timber gables in hues of deep ochre, and the protagonist found themselves standing before the heavy door of the local bathhouse, or stew. Despite the medical warnings about open pores, the human desire for the sensation of water was irrepressible. These establishments were common in medieval towns, serving as a curious hybrid of a modern spa, a social club, and, occasionally, something more scandalous. As the door creaked open, the protagonist was met by a wall of thick, aromatic steam that smelled of cedarwood, boiled herbs, and the damp heat of many bodies. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the sharp, dry dust of the street. The room was dominated by large wooden tubs, bound with iron hoops like massive wine barrels. These tubs were lined with clean linen sheets to protect the bathers from splinters and to provide a soft surface against the skin. The water was heated in massive copper cauldrons over a roaring fire in the back and carried to the tubs in buckets. This was a labor-intensive luxury, and thus, bathing was rarely a solitary act. The protagonist stepped into a tub already occupied by two others, perhaps a fellow craftsman or a weary traveler. In the Middle Ages, nudity was not the taboo we might imagine, the body was seen as a functional vessel, and communal bathing was a standard, albeit expensive, social ritual. As the protagonists submerged their limbs, the heat worked into the deep aches of the day's labor. They didn't use modern soap bars, but rather liquid lye solutions or smegma enriched with oils. Attendants, often young women or men known as stewholders, moved between the tubs offering sponges and brushes made of pig bristles to scrub the back and shoulders. It was here, in the semi-darkness of the steam-filled room, that the true news of the town was exchanged. Free from the prying eyes of the parish priest or the guild masters, the bathers spoke of rising taxes, the quality of the new harvest, and the whispered scandals of the nobility. However, the bathhouse was a place of sensory indulgence that went beyond mere cleaning. To soak in a tub was often to feast as well. Small wooden boards were floated on the surface of the water, carrying cups of spiced wine and plates of nuts or dried fruits. The heat of the water and the warmth of the wine created a sense of balsamic well-being. Yet, there was always an edge of caution. The church looked upon these stews with a wary eye, suspicious of the fleshly delights they encouraged. As the protagonist finally stood to leave, their skin glowing a deep pink and their linen chemise feeling remarkably fresh against their scrubbed skin, they stepped back out into the cooling evening air, feeling a rare, fleeting lightness that only the luxury of hot water could provide. Stepping out of the humid embrace of the bathhouse, the evening air felt like a cold blade against the protagonist's damp skin. The glow of the stews faded as they walked through the deepening purple shadows of the town. Arriving home, the focus shifted from the cleansing of the body to the preservation of the house's beating heart, the fire. In the Middle Ages, the hearth was not just for warmth, it was the light, the stove, and the protection against the spirits that were believed to roam the dark. But a fire was also a mortal threat in a city built of timber and straw. The protagonist approached the central hearth, where the fire dogs, iron supports that held the heavy logs, glowed a dull red. The ritual of the evening was governed by the curfew, a word derived from the French couvre-feu, meaning, cover the fire. As the town bell tolled the signal, the protagonist used a large brass or ceramic cover, shaped like a bell, to place over the smoldering embers. This didn't extinguish the fire, it smothered it just enough to keep it alive until morning while preventing a stray spark from leaping onto the dry rushes on the floor. To lose the fire was a disaster, as reigniting it with flint and steel was an arduous task for a cold morning. Before retreating to the shadows of the room, there was one last chore of hygiene, the sweeping of the soul. Using a broom made of birch twigs, the protagonist pushed back the top layer of rushes around the hearth. They checked for any dropped food scraps that might attract rats, the silent harbingers of the great mortality that everyone feared but few understood. The scent of the house changed as the fire was covered, the sharp, active smell of burning oak was replaced by the heavy, sweet musk of cooling ash and the scent of the dried herbs tucked into the rafters. With the fire dimmed, the room shrank. The corners vanished into a velvety blackness that felt thick and heavy. The protagonist moved by touch and the faint, silvery light of the moon filtering through the high, narrow vents. They removed their heavy outer tunic, hanging it once again near the garderobe area to let the ammonia fumes work their invisible magic on any lice picked up during the day's journey. Clad once more in their primary linen chemise, the protagonist felt the weight of the day's labor settling into their bones. The cycle was nearly complete, but the transition from the world of the living to the world of dreams required one final, communal adjustment of the great bed. The room was now a cavern of shadows, the only light provided by the faint, pulsing orange glow escaping from beneath the couvre-feu. The protagonist approached the great bed, which was less a piece of furniture and more a wooden fortress of sleep. In the Middle Ages, the bed was the most expensive and symbolic item in a household. It was a massive oak frame, often draped with heavy wool curtains that served a dual purpose. They offered a semblance of privacy in a one-room house and, more importantly, they created a microclimate, trapping the precious body heat of the occupants within a small, enclosed space. Before climbing in, the protagonist performed the nightly beating of the straw. The linen mattress, stuffed with a year's worth of stalks and husks, had become lumpy and compressed by the day's sitting. By punching and shaking the sack, they redistributed the filling and, critically, disturbed the colonies of fleas that had settled in the warmth. There was no sense of personal space. As the protagonist climbed in, they were joined by their spouse, a younger sibling, and perhaps a child. They lay, spooning, together, a human jigsaw puzzle designed for survival. The collective warmth of 4 or 5 bodies was the only thing that made a winter night survivable in a house where the walls were often just wattle and daub, porous to the freezing wind. Above them, a heavy tester or wooden canopy protected them from anything that might fall from the thatched roof, be it dust, bits of straw, or the occasional confused rodent. The pillows were not soft clouds of foam but firm bolsters stuffed with chaff or horsehair, designed to keep the head propped up. This semi-upright sleeping position was common, as many believed that lying completely flat hindered digestion and allowed vapors to rise too quickly to the brain, causing nightmares or even a stroke. The protagonist pulled up the hardened sheets, coarse, heavy linen that felt like canvas, and topped them with a cover pane of thick, matted wool. The smell was a dense layering of the day, the faint rosewater from the bathhouse, the lingering salt of sweat, the smell of wood smoke trapped in the hair, and the earthy scent of the straw below. As the household settled, the sounds of the night took over, the shifting of the cow in the lean-to attached to the house, the hoot of an owl, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the huddled family. This was the beginning of the first sleep, a deep, restorative plunge into unconsciousness that would last until the bells of the monastery rang for matins, calling the world to wake once more in the dead of night. The world did not stay silent for long. Just as the body had reached its deepest state of rest, the internal clock, sharpened by years of tradition, nudged the protagonist awake. This was the watch, the mysterious gap between the first and second sleeps that defined the medieval night. In the pitch-black room, there was no sudden reach for a light source. The protagonist remained still for a moment, listening to the heavy, synchronized breathing of the family members pressed against them. The initial, heavy exhaustion of the day's labor had evaporated, leaving behind a strange, lucid alertness. Across the town, the bells of the nearby abbey began to chime for matins. In the darkness, the protagonist sat up slowly, the dry straw of the mattress rustling loudly in the silence. This wasn't a time of annoyance at being woken, it was a time of profound reflection. For the medieval soul, the hours between midnight and 2 in the morning were the most spiritual. It was believed that the veil between the physical world and the divine was thinnest during this time. Without the distractions of sight and the noise of the street, the mind was free to wander through the landscape of its own conscience. The protagonist reached for a small tallow candle, striking a flint to catch a spark on a piece of charred linen. The tiny, flickering flame cast long, dancing shadows against the timber beams. In this pale light, the room looked different, ethereal and somewhat ghostly. They didn't leave the bed, as the floor was cold enough to bite the skin, but they used this time to pray, whispering the familiar Latin phrases of the Paternoster. Others in the household might stir as well. A husband and wife might use this quiet hour to discuss the day's finances, or a scholar might light a precious lamp to read a few lines of a manuscript. There was a peculiar physiological benefit to this broken sleep. Modern science suggests that this biphasic rhythm allowed for a specific hormonal release that reduced stress, but for our protagonist, it was simply the natural order. They might take a small sip of ale from a bedside flagon or adjust the garderobe bucket if the need arose. It was a time of mental digestion, where the dreams of the first sleep were analyzed and the anxieties of the coming day were processed. As the candle flickered down to a nub, the protagonist felt the second wave of drowsiness, the second sleep, approaching like a slow, dark tide. This next phase would be lighter, filled with vivid dreams, carrying them toward the blue light of a new dawn. As the small tallow candle sputtered and died, plunging the room back into a velvet darkness, the protagonist slid back down into the warmth of the shared blankets. The second sleep was different from the first, it was less of a heavy, stone-like unconsciousness and more of a drifting, ethereal state. Because the body had already shed its deepest exhaustion during the first 4 hours, this phase was the playground of the mind. In the Middle Ages, dreams were not seen as mere firings of the brain, but as significant messages, sometimes divine warnings, sometimes the mischievous work of spirits, and often the result of an imbalance in the stomach. In this lighter sleep, the sounds of the house became part of the dreamscape. The scurrying of a mouse in the thatch might become the footsteps of a legendary giant, the whistle of the wind through the window slit might transform into the chant of a ghostly choir. The protagonist's mind, fueled by the thick pottage and the spiced ale of the previous evening, wove together the sights of the day. The bloody gutters of the shambles mixed with the golden light of the bathhouse, creating a surreal tapestry that felt more real than the cold room itself. There was a specific hygiene of the mind associated with this second sleep. It was believed that if one slept on their right side during this time, it aided the liver in cooking the food left in the stomach, preventing the vile vapors from rising and causing terrors. The protagonist shifted their weight, feeling the scratch of the wool blanket against their chin and the solid, reassuring presence of their kin. This was the most restorative period for the spirit, a time when the harshness of medieval life, the mud, the stench, and the relentless toil, was replaced by the limitless possibilities of the subconscious. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the temperature in the room hit its lowest point. The moisture from the breath of the sleepers condensed on the heavy bed curtains, and the stone walls seemed to radiate a bone-deep chill. Yet, within the wooden fortress of the bed, the protagonist remained cocooned. This was the final sanctuary before the cycle began anew, the quietest moment of the 24-hour journey. Soon, the pre-dawn light would begin to bleed through the shutters, and the biological clock would prepare for the final transition back to the world of stone, straw, and service. The transition from the second sleep to the waking world was not a sudden leap, but a slow, shivering realization of the cold. As the first pale, blue-gray light of dawn filtered through the narrow slits of the shutters, The great bed felt less like a fortress and more like a fading island of warmth in a sea of ice. The protagonist's first sensation was the sting of the air on the tip of their nose, the only part of the body left exposed to the room's freezing breath. The moisture on the bed curtains had turned into a fine, sparkling rime of frost, and the heavy wool blankets felt weighted with the dampness of the morning. The cold awakening was a physical challenge. Moving even an inch away from the collective heat of the other sleepers invited a rush of biting air into the cocoon. With a resigned grunt, the protagonist pulled themselves from the straw mattress. Their feet, bare and sensitive, hit the floor with a shock. The rushes beneath were no longer soft, they were brittle and frozen, crunching like dry bones under the weight of a step. Every muscle in the body seemed to contract, pulling inward to protect the core. There was no time for lingering, the house was a tomb until the fire could be brought back to life. The protagonist hurried to the hearth, their breath blooming in thick white clouds. They knelt before the couvre-feu, the ceramic bell that had guarded the embers through the night. Lifting it was a moment of silent prayer. If the embers had died, the morning would be spent in a desperate, shivering struggle with flint and steel. But as the cover rose, a faint, reassuring orange glow greeted them. The embers were small, like glowing dragon's eyes buried in a bed of gray ash. Using a small bellows or simply the strength of their own lungs, the protagonist leaned close and blew. A tiny spark caught a dry tuft of straw, a thin ribbon of blue smoke spiraled upward, followed by a sudden, cheerful crackle as a splinter of kindling took hold. This was the most critical hygiene of the morning, the cleansing of the air through heat. As the flames began to lick the larger oak logs, the oppressive dampness of the room started to retreat. The protagonists stood by the growing fire, rubbing their hands together until the skin turned a mottled red. The light of the fire danced across the soot-stained rafters and the rough-hewn walls, signaling that the house was officially awake. The cycle of the previous day had closed, and the relentless, aromatic, and deeply communal life of the Middle Ages was ready to begin its next revolution. With the fire now crackling and throwing long, amber fingers of light across the room, the focus shifted to the morning scouring. In a medieval home, cleanliness was a battle fought against two primary enemies, soot and damp. The protagonist took a handful of dry horsetail plants, nature's own abrasive pads, rich in silica, and began to scrub the wooden trenchers and the iron cooking pot used the night before. There was no flowing water to rinse them, instead, they used a small amount of warm water from the kettle and a vigorous application of elbow grease. The goal was to remove the grease of the feast before it could turn rancid in the morning heat. The floor, however, required a more drastic intervention. The rushes that had served as a carpet for the past week had become a graveyard of the household's daily life. Hidden beneath the green stalks were the remnants of the evening meal, the mud tracked in from the shambles, and the inevitable spills of small ale. To leave them was to invite the pestilence of the floor. The protagonist used a heavy wooden rake to pull back the old, darkened rushes, revealing the hard-packed earthen floor beneath. The smell that rose was sharp and fermented, a mixture of decaying vegetation and the metallic tang of the earth. To counteract this, a new bundle of fresh rushes, harvested from the riverbank and dried in the sun, was brought inside. As the protagonist scattered them, the room was suddenly filled with the scent of a summer meadow. But they didn't stop there. They reached for a handful of strewing herbs, dried lavender, hyssop, and meadowsweet, and crushed them between their palms before tossing them onto the fresh green carpet. This was the medieval version of an air freshener, designed to be stepped upon. Every footfall throughout the day would release a fresh burst of fragrance, creating a sensory barrier against the less pleasant odors of the street. As the new floor was laid, the protagonist looked at the iron fire dogs and the soot-blackened walls. There was a certain dignity in this constant cycle of renewal. The house felt purified, the air scrubbed clean by the scent of lavender and the heat of the new fire. The tools of survival, the knife, the spoon, and the pot, shone in the morning light. The scouring was complete, but the most important ritual of the morning was yet to come, the preparation of the first pottage, the thick, grainy fuel that would sustain the body through the coming hours of labor. The sun had now fully cleared the horizon, its light piercing the wood smoke that drifted lazily toward the ceiling vents. The protagonist's stomach, empty since the previous midday, signaled that it was time for the breaking of the fast. In the Middle Ages, breakfast was not always a formal affair. For some, it was a luxury, but for the laborer, it was a biological necessity. The meal centered around the pottage, a dish that never truly ended. The heavy iron cauldron, hanging from a soot-covered crane over the fire, was a perpetual vessel. As the contents were eaten, new ingredients, oats, dried peas, or a handful of wild onions, were added, creating a thick, savory sediment that had been simmering for days. The protagonist ladled the gray-gold mixture into a wooden bowl. This wasn't the sweet, milky porridge of modern times. It was a hearty, salty grain stew, often flavored with a pudding of pig's blood or a knob of yellowed lard for extra calories. Every spoonful was a dense hit of energy. Alongside the pottage sat a hunk of maslin bread, a heavy, dark loaf made from a mixture of rye and wheat. The crust was as hard as a stone, serving as a protective shell for the dense, sour crumb within. To eat it, the protagonist had to dunk the bread into the hot pottage, a process that softened the grain and allowed the flavors of the hearth to soak into the dough. The drink that accompanied this was small ale, but the morning brew had a specific character. It was the bottom of the barrel, thicker and more yeasty than the clear ale served at noon. This liquid was essentially liquid bread. Because it had been fermented, it was safer than the well water, which might be tainted by the seepage from nearby cesspits. The yeast provided B vitamins that kept the nerves steady, and the mild alcohol content provided a gentle glow to combat the morning chill. They drank it from a shared wooden tankard, the grain swirling at the bottom, providing a final, chewy morsel of nourishment. As the family ate in a companionable silence, the hygiene of the meal remained paramount. Even in the rush of the morning, the unclean left hand was kept away from the communal loaf. After the last drop of ale was drained, the protagonist used a crust of bread to wipe the bowl clean, a practice that ensured not a single calorie was wasted and made the subsequent washing of the bowl much easier. The fire was now roaring, the house was scented with meadowsweet and rye, and the body was fueled. With a final check of the leather thongs on their boots, the protagonist prepared to step back out into the world, where the social and physical demands of the medieval day awaited their return. As the protagonist stepped out for the second time, the world was no longer the gray, silent void of dawn. It was a hive of industry. Whether they headed to the open fields or a cramped urban workshop, the mid-morning was the time of great sweat. In the medieval mindset, labor was the primary way to keep the body's humors in motion, stagnation was death. In the workshop, the air was a thick soup of sawdust, metal filings, or the pungent chemical tang of the tanner's yard. Hygiene here was not about being clean in the modern sense, but about protecting the body from the specific poisons of the trade. In a weaver's shop, for instance, the air was filled with tiny particles of wool and linen that settled in the lungs. To combat this, the protagonist might wear a linen cloth tied over the mouth and nose, a primitive but effective filter. Those working with lead or dyes knew the palsy that came from the materials, though they attributed it to bad air rather than chemical toxicity. They washed their hands frequently in tubs of water mixed with vinegar or strong lye, believing the sharp acidity would cut the invisible spirits of disease clinging to their skin after handling raw hides or minerals. For the farmer in the field, hygiene was dictated by the soil. The protagonist's hands became caked with the Mother Earth, a mixture of clay and manure. While a modern observer would see filth, the medieval laborer saw fertility. However, they were wary of the prick, small cuts from thorns or tools that could lead to the dreaded red fire, erysipelas or gangrene. When a cut occurred, the protocol was immediate, the wound was sucked clean, then packed with a poultice of chewed bread and spiderwebs or smeared with a green salve made of crushed leeks and honey. These natural antibiotics were the only shield against the microscopic world they couldn't see but deeply felt. The mid-morning heat began to pull the moisture from their body. The linen chemise, once crisp and fresh from the morning, now clung to the back, heavy and gray with salt. Yet, there was a strange rhythm to this discomfort. The constant movement prevented the chills of the humors, and the smell of the workshop, a mix of hot iron, beeswax, and human effort, was the scent of a functioning society. As the church bells rang for the mid-morning prayer, the protagonist took a brief moment to splash their face with water from a bucket, the droplets cool against their flushed skin, a small mercy before returning to the relentless demands of the craft. As the sun climbed to its highest point, the heat in the workshop or the open field became a heavy, physical weight. This was the hour when the water supply, the literal lifeblood of the community, became the focus of all activity. The protagonist, parched and dusty, headed toward the communal well, the great eye of the neighborhood. In the Middle Ages, the well was not just a source of hydration, it was the social engine of the town, a place where the rigid hierarchies of the day momentarily softened under the shared necessity of the bucket and the rope. The area around the well was a sensory microcosm. The ground was perpetually muddy, a dark, cool slurry that felt strangely pleasant against the leather soles of the boots compared to the baked dust of the street. The air here was different, colder, smelling of wet stone, green moss, and the faint, metallic tang of the deep earth. As the protagonists waited their turn, they observed the well-keepers, often older women or appointed town officials who ensured that no one washed their corrupt laundry or dumped waste near the mouth of the spring. Water was a gift from God, but its purity was a fragile human responsibility. The ritual of drawing water was a rhythmic, muscular task. The heavy oak bucket, bound with rusted iron, descended into the echoing dark, hitting the surface with a distant, hollow thwack. Bringing it back up required a steady hand to prevent the water from slopping into the mud. When the bucket finally breached the rim, the water was crystal clear and dangerously cold. The protagonist didn't drink directly from the bucket, instead, they used a small wooden ladle or a kostrel, a leather flask, to take a long, slow draught. This was the sweet water, the most precious commodity in a world of fermented alesh and thick stews. While they drank, the gossip of the well flowed as freely as the water. This was the medieval news feed. Here, one learned which baker was patting their loaves with peas meal, who had fallen ill with the sweating sickness, and which merchant was arriving with a shipment of fine French salt. The hygiene of the community was managed through this talk. If a household was suspected of having a foul cellar that might taint the ground, the well-side gossip was the first line of defense, a social pressure that forced the negligent to clean their drains before the town bailiff intervened. With the thirst quenched and the mind filled with the day's rumors, the protagonist shouldered a heavy yoke with 2 full buckets, carrying the weight of the afternoon's needs back toward the hearth. Leaving the cool dampness of the well, the protagonist navigated the narrow arteries of the town toward the market square. By mid-afternoon, the air here was a thick, vibrating haze of smells. This was the digestive system of the medieval world, where the hygiene of the food chain was a constant battle between regulation and the relentless heat of the sun. The protagonist didn't see modern packaging or refrigeration, instead, they saw food in its rawest, most honest forms, protected only by tradition and the watchful eyes of the market wardens. The first stop was the fish board. In an era where meat was forbidden on fast days, which occurred nearly 3 times a week, fish was the primary protein. But fish was also the most dangerous. The hygiene of the fishmonger's stall was defined by the scent of salt and vinegar. Large barrels of white herring sat in a heavy brine, a preservation method that had served humanity for centuries. Fresh fish, however, lay on beds of damp river reeds, their scales glistening. To test for freshness, the protagonist didn't just look, they performed a tactile ritual. They pressed a finger into the flesh to see if it sprang back and leaned in to sniff the gills. A muddy or sweet smell was a warning of corruption, a sign that the vapors of decay had already taken hold. In the poultry section, the hygiene was literal and loud. Birds were sold alive, tied by the legs in clusters. This was the only way to guarantee the meat wasn't carrion. The protagonist watched as a buyer selected a hen, its squawking adding to the cacophony. There was no concept of cross-contamination as we know it, yet there were rules. The blood from the slaughter had to be swillied away with buckets of water into the central gutter, and no one was allowed to sell meat by candlelight, as the flickering shadows could hide the greenish tint of spoiling flesh. The bakery was the final destination. Here, the hygiene was about purity of ingredients. The size of bread was a strict law that governed the weight and quality of every loaf. The protagonist looked for the baker's personal mark stamped into the dough, a medieval barcode that held the maker accountable. If a loaf was found to be padded with sand or sawdust, the baker would be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, the offending bread tied around their neck. As the protagonist tucked a fresh, warm loaf under their arm, the scent of toasted grain provided a brief, heavenly respite from the copper tang of the butcher's stalls. The market was a place of high stakes. One bad purchase could lead to a week of the flux, making every transaction a calculated risk in the name of survival. As the bells of the parish church began to ring for vespers, the long, slanted shadows of the building stretched across the cobblestones like dark fingers. This was the signal for the vesper wash, a crucial transition between the public life of the street and the private sanctity of the home. For the protagonist, whose skin was now a map of the day's journey, filmed with the dust of the market, the soot of the workshop, and the salt of labor, this was a moment of necessary purification. They returned to the stone basin by the door. The water, sitting in the sun for several hours, had lost its morning bite and felt deceptively soft. This wash was more thorough than the morning's quick splash. The protagonist unlaced their leather boots, feeling the sudden, cooling relief of the air on their cramped feet. They used a strigil, a curved wooden or bone scraper, to whisk away the thickest layers of dried mud from their hose and skin. This mechanical cleaning was the primary defense against the itch, scabies, and other skin ailments that thrived in the damp folds of clothing. Next came the cleaning of the face and ears. In the medieval mind, the openings of the body, the eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, were the gateways through which the miasma of the city entered. The protagonist took a rough linen cloth, dipped it in the water, and scrubbed their neck and the space behind their ears until the skin glowed. They rinsed their mouth with a mixture of water and vinegar, a sharp, acidic gargle believed to kill the worms that caused toothache. The ritual was rhythmic and meditative, a way to shed the sensory overload of the afternoon. Finally, the protagonist took a moment to tend to their hair. They used a fine-toothed comb made of boxwood to rake through the strands, meticulously searching for the small invaders, lice. In an era where everyone had them, the goal wasn't total eradication, but management. By combing out the eggs and the adults every evening, one kept the crawling at bay. As they finished, tossing the dirty water into the street gutter where it joined the city's evening effluent, the protagonist felt a sense of closure. The outer world had been washed away. They stepped back into the house, where the smell of the evening fire promised a different kind of warmth and the start of the final, quietest hours of the day. As the protagonist settled onto a low stool by the rekindled hearth, the focus shifted to the most neglected yet burdened parts of the medieval body, the feet. After a day spent navigating the uneven cobbles, the treacherous mud of the market, and the sharp grit of the workshop, the feet were more than just tired, they were the primary contact point with the corruptions of the earth. In an age where a simple blister could lead to a lethal infection of the blood, foot care was not a matter of vanity, but a ritual of survival known as the evening paring. The protagonist pulled back their woolen hose, revealing skin that was pale and indented from the ties of the points. They plunged their feet into a wooden tub of warm water, not just plain water, but a decoction of boiled bay leaves and salt. The salt acted as a primitive antiseptic, while the bay leaves were believed to draw out the weary humors that settled in the lower extremities. The sensation was a sharp, stinging relief that pulsed through the arches and heels. As the heat softened the calluses earned from miles of walking in thin-soled turn shoes, the protagonist began the delicate task of paring. Using a small, razor-sharp knife, the same one used for carving wood or cutting bread, though wiped clean for the task, they carefully trimmed the nails. This was a slow, deliberate process. Long or jagged nails were a liability, they caught on the linen of the hose, creating holes that let in the cold, or worse, they became ingrown, inviting the red swelling that could ground a laborer for weeks. They scraped away the softened skin of the heels and the balls of the feet, removing the layers of dead tissue that trapped sweat and promoted the stinking foot, fungal infections. Once the skin was smooth and cleaned of the day's grime, the protagonist applied a thick, yellow salve. This was a healing grease made from rendered mutton tallow mixed with a few drops of pine resin. The tallow provided a waterproof barrier, while the resin acted as a natural antimicrobial agent. They massaged the grease into the cracks of the skin, their hands working the thick fat until it disappeared into the pores. This was the final layer of armor. When they pulled on a fresh, dry pair of linen socks, simple rectangles of fabric wrapped around the foot, the protagonist felt a profound sense of restoration. The foundations of their body were secure once more. The feet, having carried the weight of the medieval world all day, were finally allowed to rest in the warm, scented shadows of the evening fire. As the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, the family gathered for the silent supper. Unlike the bustling midday meal, the evening repast was a subdued affair, meant to settle the spirit before the long night. There was no fresh pottage now. Instead, they ate the leavings, the thickened, cold remains of the morning's grain stew, perhaps fortified with a few slices of hard cheese or a handful of dried nuts. The hygiene of this meal was defined by the communal cup, a single large vessel of spiced wine or strong ale that was passed from hand to hand. Drinking from a shared cup required its own set of social filters. Before taking a sip, the protagonist followed the etiquette of the lip. They used a corner of their linen sleeve or a small scrap of cloth to wipe their mouth clean of grease. To leave a fatty film on the rim of the cup was a grave insult to the next drinker and was believed to pass the humors of the throat, coughs and colds, to the rest of the family. They drank deeply, the warmth of the alcohol acting as a final sedative for the day's aches. The cheese they ate was a hard-rind variety, aged for months and encased in a thick layer of wax or gray mold. The protagonist used their personal knife to carefully peel away the outer skin of the cheese, discarding the moldy bits into the rushes. This was a learned hygiene. While they didn't know about bacteria, they knew that the blue fur could cause a griping of the gut. The meal was eaten mostly in a companionable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the straw. After the cup had made its final round, the protagonist performed the scouring of the knife. They didn't use water, which would rust the precious iron blade, but rather a knife board covered in fine sand and leather. By rubbing the blade vigorously against the sand, they polished away the acids of the cheese and the juices of the meat, leaving the metal bright and sterile for the morning. The board was then leaned against the wall, the crumbs from the table were swept toward the hearth for the alms basket, and the family prepared for the final transition. The day's physical requirements had been met. Now, only the spiritual and biological demands of the darkness remained. The fire had now burned down to a deep, pulsing crimson. The last light, the single rushlight or tallow candle that had illuminated the supper, was guttering in its iron holder. In the medieval world, the coming of total darkness was not merely the absence of sun, it was the arrival of a different realm, one where the miasma of the night was believed to thicken and flow through the streets. To prepare for sleep was to prepare for a period of vulnerability, and the hygiene of the soul was just as important as the hygiene of the house. The protagonist moved through the room for one final check. They ensured the window shades, heavy wooden shutters or frames stretched with oiled linen, were tightly barred. This wasn't just to keep out thieves, it was to block the night air, which was thought to carry the seeds of the ague and the plague. By sealing the house, they created a controlled atmosphere, filtered by the lingering scent of the lavender in the rushes and the drying herbs in the rafters. They made a final sign of the cross over the door and the hearth, a spiritual seal against the perceived shadows. Before extinguishing the candle, the protagonist performed the night watch of the body. They loosened any remaining ties on their clothing, ensuring that nothing constricted the flow of the blood during sleep. They checked the piss pot one last time, ensuring it was tucked far under the bed to keep the pungent vapors from rising into the sleeping space. Finally, they used their fingers to pinch out the candle flame. The smell of hot tallow and smoldering wick filled the room, a sharp, fatty scent that signaled the absolute end of the day's labor. As they climbed back into the great bed, joining the huddle of family, the protagonist felt the weight of the darkness settling over the roof. The house was now a closed system, a warm, breathing organism protected by timber, stone, and ritual. The cycles of washing, eating, laboring, and praying had been completed with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. In the profound silence of the medieval night, broken only by the distant call of a watchman or the shift of a log in the hearth, the protagonist drifted toward the first sleep, surrendered to the rhythm of a world that moved by the light of the stars and the heat of the fire. Though the house was sealed against the night air, it was far from empty. The moment human bodies grew still and warmth began to pool beneath the heavy wool blankets, another world awakened, the world of the night guests. In the Middle Ages, hygiene was not so much a war of total extermination against insects as it was a constant maneuvering to manage their numbers. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were seen not as a sign of poverty, but as an inevitable burden of the flesh that everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the king, had to reckon with. As the protagonist drifted toward sleep, they felt the first familiar itch. Fleas, hiding in the straw of the mattress or the deep crevices of the oak bed frame, reacted to the carbon dioxide and warmth of human breath. To counter this, medieval people used flea traps, small, carved cases of ivory or wood with tiny holes, containing a scrap of cloth soaked in honey or animal blood. These were placed under pillows or hung around the neck, in the hope that the insects would choose the easier bait over living skin. Beyond fleas, there was the threat of night fire, bedbugs. Against them, sharp scents were deployed, the bedposts were sometimes smeared with tar or wormwood oil, whose bitter aroma repelled the insects. The protagonist knew that if the itching became unbearable, a scratcher had to be kept close at hand, a long, thin bone wand that allowed one to reach the back without leaving the warm embrace of the blankets. This was not considered a sign of neglect, on the contrary, regular scratching was seen as beneficial, as it stimulated the skin and drew out stagnant blood. This nightly struggle was part of medieval stoicism. People understood they were part of a vast chain of life, where even the smallest creatures had their place, often interpreted as a divine punishment for sins or a test of patience. Falling asleep to the rhythmic clicking of a family member's teeth as they tried to catch a persistent insect, the protagonist accepted this discomfort as a fact of life. The body was merely a temporary vessel, and true purity, as they were taught, awaited only in the spiritual realm, where there was no dust, no parasites, and no need for constant scouring. As the second sleep deepened, the protagonist's mind began to weave intricate, often terrifying tapestries. In the medieval world, dreams were not merely random firings of the imagination, they were viewed as diagnostic tools. The science of dreams was inextricably linked to the state of the stomach and the balance of the four humors. Physicians of the time believed that the quality of one's visions provided a direct window into the internal hygiene of the body. If the protagonist dreamt of fire, red landscapes, or violent battles, it was a sign of choler, an excess of yellow bile. This suggested the body was overheating and needed cooling foods or perhaps a bloodletting in the morning. Conversely, dreams of water, drowning, or slow-moving mists indicated an excess of phlegm, signaling that the body was too cold and damp. The hygiene of the mind was thus a reflection of the hygiene of the gut. A heavy, poorly digested supper of windy beans or salted pork was known to fume upward to the brain, distorting the spirit's rest. The protagonist might stir in their sleep, troubled by a mare, a word derived from the belief that a literal weight or a demonic entity sat upon the chest to stifle the breath. To the medieval observer, this wasn't sleep apnea, it was the result of thick blood or undigested vapors blocking the channels of the heart. To cleanse the spirit during these hours, many kept a dream token near the bed, perhaps a dried sprig of St. John's wort or a small leaden pilgrim's badge. These objects were thought to act as spiritual filters, straining out the foul fantasies sent by the devil and ensuring the soul remained as polished as a mirror. As the dawn neared, the dreams grew lighter. This transition was considered the most truthful period for visions, as the stomach was now empty and the humors had settled. The protagonist would wake and immediately recount their dreams to their family, not for entertainment, but to assess their health. Was the tongue dry? Was the head heavy? The morning's hygiene would be adjusted based on these nocturnal reports, turning the abstract world of sleep into a practical guide for surviving the physical world. As the first true rays of the sun pierced the gaps in the shutters, the protagonist faced the most intimate of morning challenges, morning breath. In the medieval world, a foul smell from the mouth was not just a social faux pas, it was considered a sign of internal decay, rotting of the humors that could corrupt the very air one breathed. To combat this, the protagonist did not reach for a plastic brush, but for the hedgerow. Stepping into the small yard, they snapped a fresh, green twig from a hazel or willow tree. This was the chew stick. By fraying the end with their teeth until it became a fibrous brush, they created a tool that was both mechanical and chemical. The sap of the willow contained salicylates, natural ancestors to aspirin, which acted as an anti-inflammatory for the gums. They rubbed the frayed end vigorously against their teeth, scrubbing away the film of the night, with a dedication that would surprise a modern observer. For a deeper scouring, the protagonist dipped the stick into a small jar of dentifrice. This wasn't a minty paste, but a harsh, abrasive powder made from burnt bread crusts, powdered coral, or even the white ash of burned rosemary. This charcoal-like substance acted as a powerful exfoliant, polishing the enamel and absorbing the volatile sulfur compounds that caused odors. The sensation was gritty and dry, but it left the teeth feeling remarkably smooth. To finish the ritual, they rinsed their mouth with a wash of vinegar mixed with mint or a handful of aniseeds. The sharp acidity of the vinegar acted as a potent antimicrobial, while the aniseed provided a lingering sweetness. This wasn't just about fresh breath for its own sake, a clean mouth was believed to protect the lungs and the heart from the vapors of the pit. As they spat the gray, gritty residue into the gutter, the protagonist felt a sharp, cooling clarity, the first victory in the daily battle for bodily purity. To a modern observer, the lack of a daily shower in the Middle Ages suggests a life of perpetual grime. However, the medieval secret to hygiene lay not in the application of water, but in the changing of the linen. For the protagonist, their linen chemise, the smock or shirt, was a secondary skin. It was more than a garment, it was a biological filter designed to wick away the excrements of the skin, the sweat, oils, and humors that the body expelled throughout the day. This morning, the protagonist pulled off the heavy wool tunic to reveal the white linen beneath. It was now gray and stiff at the armpits and neck, having successfully captured the impurities of the previous 24 hours. This was the dry Washington. By removing the soiled linen and replacing it with a fresh, bleached garment, they were effectively washing their body. Linen was prized because it was easy to boil and scrub, unlike wool, which trapped smells and was difficult to clean. The fresh shirt had been laundered in a way that provided its own chemical protection. It had been washed in a lye made from wood ash and human urine, a source of ammonia, then rinsed in a stream and spread over a hawthorn bush to dry in the sun. The ultraviolet rays acted as a natural bleach and disinfectant, while the blossoms imparted a faint, floral scent. As the protagonist pulled the cool, crisp fabric over their head, the sensation was one of immediate renewal. They then took a rough linen cloth and performed a friction rub over their torso and limbs. This vigorous rubbing served two purposes: it exfoliated the dead skin and stimulated the vital spirits of the blood. The medieval person believed that as long as the linen against their skin was white and fresh, the body remained pure. To have clean linen was the ultimate mark of a civilized person, a barrier of light between the vulnerable human flesh and the chaotic, dusty world outside. On this particular morning, the protagonist didn't head straight to the workshop. Instead, they sought out the pole with the red and white stripes, the sign of the Barber-Surgeon. In the Middle Ages, the barber was much more than a hair cutter, he was the guardian of the body's internal plumbing. If the Vesper wash or the green twig were the daily tactics of hygiene, the visit to the barber was the strategic overhaul. The shop smelled of iron, hot towels, and sharp bay rum. The protagonist sat in a heavy wooden chair, leaning their head back for a shave of the soul. The barber used a straight razor of forged steel, stropping it rhythmically on a leather belt. But the hygiene here wasn't just about removing hair. The barber examined the protagonist's scalp and skin with a practiced eye, looking for the eruptions, the boils or rashes that signaled a blockage of the humors. Then came the more serious ritual, phlebotomy, or bloodletting. To the medieval mind, the blood was like the water in the town's gutters. If it became too thick or stagnant, it bred disease. The protagonist offered their arm, which the barber tied off with a linen strip to make the veins swell. With a quick, precise flick of a phlegm, a small lancet, a measured amount of blood was released into a pewter bowl. This was the ultimate, internal scouring. As the dark red liquid flowed, the protagonist felt a strange, light-headed relief. They believed they were purging the melancholy and the burnt blood accumulated from weeks of heavy eating. After the bleeding, the barber applied a styptic of alum and spiderwebs to stop the flow and wrapped the arm in clean linen. To finish, they trimmed the protagonist's hair, not for fashion, but to ventilate the brain. Long, matted hair was thought to trap the heat of the head, causing headaches and dullness of wit. As the protagonists stepped out of the shop, their skin tingling from the razor and their arms slightly throbbing, they felt lighter and clearer. Their internal and external fluids had been rebalanced, a deep tissue cleaning that prepared them to face the physical stresses of the season. While the protagonist headed to work, the household's linen, the filters of the family's health, faced a violent and chemical transformation. Medieval laundry was not a gentle chore, it was a grueling, multi-day process known as the bucking. In the medieval mind, clothes weren't just dirty with mud, they were saturated with human vapors and corrupt salts that required a chemical assault to remove. The process began at the bucking tub. The protagonist's family didn't have soap as we know it, bars of animal fat were expensive and reserved for the skin. Instead, they used lye. They layered the soiled linens in a massive wooden vat, covering them with a heavy cloth. On top of this, they spread a thick layer of hardwood ashes. Boiling water was then poured over the ashes, leaching out the potassium carbonate to create a caustic lye that trickled down through the clothes, eating away the grease and body oils. If the stains were particularly stubborn, the yellowing of sweat or the deep grime of the workshop, they used the ammonia treatment. This involved aged urine, or chamber lye. Collected in vats and left to ferment until it reached a pungent, alkaline potency, it was the most effective degreaser available. The women of the house would tread the clothes in this mixture, their bare feet acting as the agitators of a washing machine, braving the biting cold and the overwhelming stench for the sake of a white finish. The final stage was the rinsing and bleaching. The linens were hauled to the riverbank, where they were beaten against flat stones with wooden battledores to drive out the lye and the dirt. Then came the sun bleach. The wet clothes were spread out on the green, a grassy meadow designated for drying. The combination of the oxygen released by the grass and the ultraviolet light of the sun acted as a natural peroxide. As the protagonist returned home in the evening, the sight of the white linens glowing against the green grass was a sign of victory. The poisons of the body had been extracted and neutralized, and the family's second skin was once again pure, crisp, and safe to wear. For the protagonist, life was not always lived within the familiar walls of their town. Occasionally, the call of the road required travel, a journey to a distant fair or a pilgrimage to a holy site. In the Middle Ages, the road was the ultimate enemy of hygiene. It was a ribbon of deep, liquid mud in the winter and a choking cloud of powdered manure in the summer. To travel was to be unclean, and maintaining the body's integrity on the move was a specialized survival skill. The primary defense was the traveler's cloak and the gaiters. Before setting out, the protagonist wrapped their legs in long strips of linen or leather, known as wintigas. These acted as a sacrificial layer. When they stepped into a slough of despond, a puddle of unknown depth and contents, it was the gaiters that absorbed the filth, keeping the precious woolen hose beneath relatively dry. Hygiene on the road was about containment. Since a bath was impossible, the protagonist carried a dry pouch. Inside was a sponge soaked in strong vinegar and dried herbs. When the miasma of the road, the smell of rotting carcasses or the stagnant marshes, became overwhelming, they would press the sponge to their nose. This wasn't just for comfort, they believed the sharp acidity of the vinegar acted as a shield for the lungs, filtering out the invisible seeds of the marsh fever, malaria. Water on the road was a gamble. The protagonist avoided drinking from standing pools or slow-moving streams, which were known to house the flux, dysentery. Instead, they relied on their kostrel, a wooden or leather flask filled with high-alcohol cider or hard ale. This fermented liquid was biologically stable and provided the calories needed for a 20-mile trek. At night, when they reached a roadside inn, the hygiene was communal and risky. They would never sleep directly on the provided straw, which was often lively with the fleas of 1,000 previous travelers. Instead, they unrolled their own small traveling sheet, a piece of linen treated with oil of lavender, creating a thin, scented barrier between themselves and the chaos of the public bed. To survive the road was to remain a closed system in an open, dirty world. While the common laborer struggled with mud and vinegar, the highest standard of medieval hygiene was found behind the silent stone walls of the monasteries. For the monk, cleanliness was not just a social duty, it was a liturgical requirement. To serve God with unwashed hands was a spiritual crime. The protagonist, perhaps visiting a local abbey to deliver goods, would witness a level of hydraulic engineering that felt almost miraculous, the Great Lavatorium. The lavatorium was a dedicated stone structure, often circular or octagonal, located in the cloister. Here, a constant stream of fresh water was channeled through lead pipes from distant springs, a feat of Roman-style plumbing preserved by the church. Long lead or stone troughs featured bronze taps, allowing dozens of monks to wash simultaneously. The hygiene here was rhythmic, they washed before the first light of matins, before every meal, and after working in the scriptorium or the gardens. Inside the monastery, the daily scourge took on a physical form. The monks used hard soaps, often imported from Castile or Marseilles, made from olive oil and barilla ash. Unlike the harsh, stinking lye used by the peasantry, this soap was gentle and left the skin smelling of the earth rather than the stable. They also practiced the mandatum, the ritual washing of the feet of the poor and each other, turning the most humble act of hygiene into a profound lesson in humility and communal health. Perhaps most striking was the monastic latrine, or the reerdorder. Unlike the pisspots and cesspits of the town, monastic latrines were often built directly over a diverted stream or a fast-moving leat. The waste was instantly carried away by the rushing water, preventing the accumulation of foul vapors that the monks believed led to spiritual and physical decay. As the protagonist watched the monks file out, their tonsured heads gleaming and their linen habits bone-white, they saw the medieval ideal, a life where the purity of the water reflected the purity of the soul. As the calendar turned toward the dog days of July and August, the protagonist faced the most dangerous period of the medieval year, the season of the sweat. In a world without fans or refrigeration, the rising heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a physical threat to the humors. The medieval medical mind believed that extreme heat caused the blood to boil and the pores to open too wide, allowing the vital spirits to leak out and the pestilential air to creep in. To survive the summer, the protagonists shifted their hygiene toward cooling. This involved a radical change in their sensory environment. They replaced the heavy straw rushes on the floor with green strewings, freshly cut mint, meadowsweet, and rushes soaked in cold water. As people walked over them, the plants released a cool, moisture-laden scent that acted as a primitive form of air conditioning. The goal was to lower the ambient corruption of the room. The daily wash also transformed. Instead of the warm vesper wash, the protagonist sought out still waters. They would head to a shaded part of the river or a deep stone cellar where the air remained chilled. Here, they performed the pulse rinse, splashing cold water specifically on the wrists, the temples, and the back of the neck. They believed these were the gates of the heart, and by cooling the blood at these points, they could prevent the frenzy brought on by the summer sun. Dietary hygiene was equally strict. They avoided heating foods like garlic, onions, and heavy red wine, which were thought to add fuel to the internal fire. Instead, they drank verjuice, the tart, acidic juice of unripened grapes mixed with cold well water. This sharp drink was believed to constrict the pores from the inside out, keeping the body's moisture locked in. For the protagonist, summer hygiene was a delicate dance of staying closed and cold while the world outside baked, a constant effort to keep the internal thermometer from tipping into the realm of fever. In the final hours of our journey, we must understand that for the protagonist, hygiene was not just about what you could touch, it was about what you could smell. In a world governed by the miasma theory, a bad odor was not merely unpleasant, it was the literal carrier of the invisible death. To smell filth was to inhale the plague. Therefore, the highest form of personal hygiene was the creation of a scented shield. When the protagonist had to enter a crowded market or a narrow, stinking alleyway, they reached for their most vital piece of medical equipment, the pomander. This was often a small, perforated ball made of silver or wood, hung from the belt or held in the hand. Inside was a dense, waxy mass of preservatives, ambergris, musk, cloves, and dried rose petals. By constantly sniffing this concentrated sweetness, they believed they were creating a physical barrier in their nostrils that prevented the foul vapors of the street from reaching their lungs. For those who couldn't afford a silver pomander, the hygiene of the senses was more organic. They carried a tussie-mussy, a small, tight bouquet of herbs like rosemary, thyme, and lavender. Every few steps, they would crush the leaves to release the essential oils. This was sanitization by scent. They also used smelling salts made from vinegar-soaked sponges to sharpen the spirits when the heavy, humid air of the city threatened to make them faint. Inside the home, this sensory hygiene extended to the smoldering. At sunset, the protagonist would throw a handful of dried juniper berries or frankincense onto the hearth. The thick, aromatic smoke was believed to scour the air, chasing out the invisible demons of disease that lurked in the corners. In the medieval mind, if your environment smelled like a garden or a cathedral, you were safe. Purity was a fragrance, and as long as the scent of herbs prevailed over the scent of decay, the protagonist believed their body remained an unassailable fortress.